As a newcomer to keeping reptiles, it is a really daunting task choosing which species is going to be the first one that you keep, because there is just an enormous number of them. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about what I think is the best species, or at least what I can say is a very good species for the beginner to the hobby in terms of lizards. Now, I'm only going to be talking about the 3 species that I keep that are recommended for beginners, which entails the bearded dragon, the leopard gecko and the crested gecko, because I do have some decent experience with them, and other species that are recommended for beginners sometimes I haven't got experience with, so it wouldn't really be fair for me to comment on them. Now, I'm also not going to be talking about other sort of genres of reptiles, if you like. I won't be talking about whether tortoises are good for beginners or which snakes are the best for beginners, because I've only ever kept one snake, and so it sort of really wouldn't be fair for me to talk about anything else other than the lizards. Now, on that note, it is March and I have kept my bearded dragon since June, so I've got a bit of experience under my belt with him. I have had quite a lot of things have gone on with me beardy since then, and then crested geckos I've kept for over 2 years, and leopard geckos I've kept for nearly 5. So I would say that I have got enough experience now to sort of pass comments on what I think is the best for a newcomer to the hobby. So before we crack on with the comparisons, I do just want to outline some things before we start, and that is that I'm not going to be saying like which is the best based on very biased things. So I'm not going to be saying that bearded dragons are better than crested geckos, for example, because they look cooler or something, or say that crested geckos are worse than leopard geckos because leopard geckos come out earlier in the day, because those sorts of things, it's like very personalised. Like being nocturnal might be an asset to somebody who works nights, whereas being awake in the day might be better for somebody who's like me, where they're up in the daytime. Just another disclaimer that I'll pop in before we start is that by beginner species or beginner lizard, I don't mean that any of these species are indestructible. They do have very specific care requirements that must be met in order for them to thrive, and most people that keep them do keep them wrong. I'm just going to put it out there. Most of the reptiles that are kept in captivity aren't kept fairly, and they aren't kept properly, and they aren't allowed to thrive. So before you actually decide to get something, after watching this video, if you make a choice on it, then make sure you spend hours researching things in more detail to find out exactly how you're going to keep your new pet. Now, that aside, by beginner, I do mean that these species are best for the beginner, so they do have specific care requirements, as I've just said, but these might be more easy to achieve than for more advanced species, as it were. Of course, if you're a beginner, you might not actually be familiar with the species that I'm going to be addressing, which is, just to state them again, the leopard gecko, the crested gecko, and the bearded dragon. So I will just give a brief outline to all of them. So leopard geckos are a small terrestrial gecko species coming from Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, northern India, and sort of the regions around there. They are crepuscular, meaning that they come out at dawn and dusk, although they will be active at other times of the day. They're insectivores by nature, so they will eat mostly insects, although they will take smaller vertebrates if that option's available to them. And in captivity, they are generally very, very calm species, very, very docile, and just really nice to work with. Now, crested geckos are significantly different, despite them being another gecko species. They actually come from New Caledonia, which is an archipelago off the east coast of Australia. And unlike the leopard geckos, they are omnivores, eating fruits, as well as insects, small invertebrates, and seeds, and occasionally small vertebrates. I have heard of that. And they are too crepuscular. And lastly, the bearded dragon is the most different of the bunch. Versus the geckos that I'm talking about today, the bearded dragon is much, much larger. Leopard geckos and crested geckos being small enough to fit in one palm of your hand, whereas a bearded dragon's going to take up the length of your forearm, and that is including the tail, which is rather long. Now beardies are from Australia, Central Australia. Well, the bearded dragons that we keep are anyway, the Centralian bearded dragon. And they are the ones that you're going to find kept in pet shops and that all around the world. Now, these are omnivores like the Crested Gecko, but they won't eat fruit. They'll be eating more leaves and vegetables and stuff in captivity. And they are also diurnal, so they're awake in the day, unlike the geckos. So now it's the part of the video where we're going to be actually comparing the different species and the merits. Now, of course, to do this justly, I'm going to have a couple of categories to rate them on. And I've got those outlined, so what we're going to be addressing is caging requirements, electrical requirements, diet, handling, health concerns, which is a big one actually, maintenance, overall costs, and then at the end of the video we'll be reaching a conclusion as to which I think is the best beginner lizard species. So to start off, let's address caging requirements. Now, both the leopard geckos and the crested geckos, being small lizards, don't need enormous enclosures. For a leopard gecko, they tend to want sort of longer, lower enclosures, as they are mainly terrestrial, meaning that they walk on the ground as opposed to up trees. And this can measure sort of a minimum of 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, so a 2 foot cube. Although bigger is better really. Some people will go smaller than that. I have kept them in enclosures smaller than that. But my Cresties current enclosure, which is behind me, is just shy of 2 foot by 2 foot in terms of height and depth. So, you know, backwards. And then it is 3 feet long, and that does him well. Crested geckos, being arboreal, as in they do climb trees, are going to want a taller enclosure, so usually 2 feet tall is what's recommended, with a 45 by 45 centimetre base. As crested geckos do like a nice humid environment, keeping them in a wooden enclosure would mean that it would rot really quickly, whereas leopard geckos don't need that, so that does make the caging for crested geckos more expensive than for leopard geckos, although we'll talk about costs later. Now for bearded dragons, they are going to need a big cage. The absolute minimum is going to be 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, and that is 4 feet being the length from side to side, because like the leopard geckos, they tend to be more terrestrial. But honestly, the bigger is better. Mine is in a 5 foot long enclosure by 2 feet by 2 feet, and he uses every inch of it. So for a beginner, really, bearded dragons do take up a lot of space, and if you're going to get one, then you do need to make sure that you've got that space available. So one of the big things for me as a beginner was really getting to terms with what electrical equipment I needed for my reptiles. Now, taking this into consideration, I am going to sort of, compare the different electrical requirements of each of the species, because they are different, and sort of the more stuff you're going to need, it's the more things that you're going to have to think about, and the different parameters and stuff you're going to have to get sorted. Now for the leopard gecko, all you're going to need is your heater, and you are going to want a UVB bulb, in my opinion. People will tell you you don't need this, but I am always a big advocate of UVB provision. But really this is quite simple. You just need your thermostat to control a heater, and apart from that, just a couple of fittings and you're good to go. The crested gecko is quite similar, only if you're going to keep live plants with the cresties, you will want a nice plant light for that, but that is sort of besides the argument. So honestly, leopard geckos and crested geckos are on par with this. But bearded dragons, there is far more to take into consideration, because a bearded dragon definitely will need a nighttime drop in temperature, so they're going to have it nice and hot in the day, as it would be out in the outback in Australia, and then it's going to drop down to no less than 10 degrees Celsius at night. So you're going to want timers and stuff to change that. Of course you can provide that for the other species, but it's definitely necessary for a bearded dragon. You can't get away without providing that. And they definitely do need UVB. You can't skimp on it, they will need it, and it's going to be a higher output. And then beardies from the outback do need much higher temperatures than the geckos. So the absolute hotspot for a cresty is going to be about 30 degrees. Then ambient at the hot zone, or just the hot end, for a leopard gecko is going to be about 30 as well. Whereas for a bearded dragon it's going to be up to about 45, and that is all in degrees Celsius. And just to mention it while we're on the topic, for each of these species, you are going to want to provide a temperature gradient from one end of the enclosure to the other. So at one end it's going to be the hot zone, or the basking zone, and that is going to be the hottest, and then it's going to trail down to about room temperature at the other end, so that the reptile throughout the day can move across the enclosure and choose exactly which temperature it wants to be at. So just to summarise that point, leopard geckos and crested geckos are pretty much the same when it comes to what electrical thingies you're going to have to get them. And bearded dragons, honestly, the concepts are pretty much the same, but it's all going to be on a larger scale for a larger enclosure, and you are going to need higher powered stuff for the heat lamps to achieve the hotter temperatures. And in each case you are going to have to invest in a thermostat, and these can be quite expensive, so it's just something I'd pop in there, but it's not really a difference between them. Diet is quite another big consideration when it comes to what species you're going to keep. Leopard geckos, as I mentioned, are obligate insectivores, so they pretty much eat just insects. They can have little things like day-old mice and stuff very, very occasionally, but honestly, you don't need those. There's only some circumstances where you might want to offer them, but you can basically ignore that. It's just insects they're going to have to eat. For some people, insects are a big no-no. They don't want to touch them, don't want to go near them, and so leopard geckos are completely out of the frame. And this is where many people would say cresties are great because they don't need insects. But that's wrong. To be honest, that is just, yeah, they'll survive without insects, just having fruits and things. But in the wild, their diet is going to be about 50% insects. And so to deny them that in captivity is just completely wrong, in my opinion. And basically that puts leopard geckos and crested geckos on par again when it comes to diet. Because leopard geckos do tend to eat less in my experience. So an adult leopard gecko may only need to eat once a week, a couple of insects once a week is what mine's on at the minute. And then a crested gecko could have the same amount of insects every week, but then they are going to want things throughout the week, and that is where the fruit comes in. Now, you don't have to like peel an orange for them and chuck it in there or whatever. Basically what you want to get instead is actually mixes like the Arcadia Sticky Foot Gold that I should be showing you right now. And all you do is mix these with water and give them out in a dish, and the gecko will come and lick them up. For bearded dragons, they are going to have to be fed far more than the others because they're kept at higher temperatures, which means that they have a higher resting metabolic rate, and so they do need to be fed pretty much every day. As they're getting older, you can skip some days and that, but most of that is going to be vegetables and plant matter, and that's going to want to be offered at all times. When they're young, you want to give them insects pretty much every day as well, and then when they're fully grown, they don't need as much protein anymore, so you can cut insects back to feedings 2 or 3 times a week. But overall, bearded dragons are going to eat far more than the others. Leopard geckos are really the easiest to feed because you only have to feed them a couple of bugs once a week. Then crested geckos are a bit more complex and more tasking because you're going to have to feed them the same as the leopard geckos and mix up the fruit paste a couple of times a week as well. And then, as I've said, the beardies are going to need food every day. Really though, none of them are very hard to feed at all. Basically, it's pretty simple what you've got to do. As long as you've got the right foods and in the right sort of variation, you're going to be fine. Now, handling is where things start to get really quite interesting, at least in my personal experiences anyway. So for a beginner, being able to handle a reptile was a really, really big thing for me. As I've sort of kept reptiles for more and more years, I sort of more enjoy sitting back and just enjoying them. So not being able to hold a reptile is not really a big thing for me. I'm perfectly happy to see them happy themselves in their own environment. But it's definitely something for the newcomer to the hobby that is going to be really important. Now, on that note, leopard geckos are the clear winners when it comes to handling as far as I'm concerned. They're small enough to just hold in your hand, and they don't tend to jump, and they're not very flighty. When they're young, they can be a little bit skittish, but they grow out of that fairly soon. So handling them is really good. They're not going to bite you if you hold them properly, and they're just an absolute pleasure to work with. Quite funny at times, to be honest, with just how cute they look and that. Now, crested geckos are really, really different to leopard geckos when it comes to handling, because they do, being arboreal, have a tendency to jump about, and so you can be like trying to catch them and all that, and they're jumping around and stuff. And for the newcomer, that is not really very ideal at all. And the other thing that's really bad with cresties for handling is that, well, lizards, as you might know, can often shed the tails. Leopard geckos can do it, but are very reluctant to, and it will grow back if they shed the tail. Whereas a crested gecko is very, very likely to drop its tail. Just a sudden scare, they will drop the tail, and it doesn't grow back. So you're left with a lizard that hasn't got a tail, and that is sort of like, you know, some people will react to that more differently than others. You know, some people really like the lizards to have tails, and if that's you, then basically crested geckos are not for you if you're going to handle them. I actually don't handle my own crested gecko anymore, because I felt that he didn't really get anything from it. It was just like for me to touch him, and if he shed his tail, then that was going to be like a big change for him and stuff, and I don't want to put him through that. So for handling, crested geckos are, in my opinion, out of the picture. Of course, different animals are different to each other in their personalities, but in my circumstance, I don't really like to handle mine because he just does not like it. Bearded dragons are, again, a whole different kettle of fish when it comes to handling them, to the others that I've already mentioned. Now, I will kick off by saying that they can't shed the tails. They can drop off if they get a disease called tail rot, but they aren't going to shed them out of fear, which is a good thing for me, because when you're like trying to tame them down and the flighty and stuff, you don't want to be terrified of them dropping the tail and it not growing back like you are with a cresty. But with bearded dragons being larger and having quite sharp claws, you can't like sit with them in your hands like you can with a leopard gecko, because you are just going to get cut up and they're not going to be comfortable just sat on one hand, say. So when you're getting a bearded dragon out, it's more sort of the case that you'll set them down in a playpen or something, give them a stroke, let them run round for some exercise, and just enjoy them. Now, I really do enjoy that, but it's a completely different experience to holding a leopard gecko, where you're actually handling them, whereas with a bearded dragon, you just sort of enjoying being with them, and you can give them a touch and a stroke and that. So it is something to consider when you're choosing which one you want to get. Health concerns are something that are sort of overlooked by many people when they sort of address which species they think is the best for the beginner. But I'm not going to. I want to talk about a couple of health risks that are sort of important, I feel, for the beginner to know when they're getting into keeping a species. Now, for crested geckos, as I mentioned, there is the tail dropping thing, and there is that tail dropping thing for leopard geckos too, and sort of the stump that's going to be there for a short while before it heals over for a cresty or before the new tail goes for a leopard gecko. There is a risk of infection there, but that isn't a very big one. But for crested geckos, there is something else that can go wrong with the tails, and that is a thing called floppy tail syndrome, where the gecko, when it's like sat on a wall, because they can climb up like flat glass and that, if they've got the head down here and the tail up here, the tail will like flop over or flop at a funny angle, and hence floppy tail syndrome. Now, that is generally harmless. In fact, my crested gecko's actually got floppy tail syndrome, and what specifically causes it, nobody really knows, and what you can do about it, there's basically nothing. But if it gets really, really bad, and the crested gecko's got a tendency to sleep upside down on its glass, then the weight of the tail pulling on the hips can actually sort of deform them a bit, and that is really something that is not nice. To dissuade it, you have to offer like horizontal sleeping regions and that, which my Cresty's got, and so why he's got floppy tail syndrome, I don't know, but it does him no harm, although it is something to think about. Now for bearded dragons, the major health thing that I want to address is brumation. Now brumation is when in the winter what they're going to do is basically go asleep for months on end. And for the beginner, this is a really sort of daunting prospect. Like, your pet is going to go asleep for a quarter of a year without eating and without any heat. It's like a really big sort of scary thing when you're getting into it. I've only been through brumation with my bearded dragon Char once, and it was sort of interesting, shall we put it. But it is something that before you get a bearded dragon you want to get well read up on. Although it's not sort of a disease, as it were, it's gonna happen. It's just something you want to be well versed with before it comes about. Now, one positive aspect of all reptiles really is that they don't need much maintenance time. For leopard geckos, maintenance is literally change out the water like every day, every couple of days or something, and feed them once a week. Then give them some exercise, a bit of handling, say once a week if they're in an appropriately sized cage. With crested geckos, the only other things you're going to have to do is, because they like high humidity, you want to mist them down with water, so get a spray bottle, pump it up, and then use it to like spray them down. You can get automatic misters to do this for you, but they are really expensive, and for the beginner you're not going to need one. So doing that sort of once or twice a day, depending on the humidity in your house, is going to be fine. And for your beardies, maintenance is literally restricted to feeding them. And also you might want to like offer them water out of the end of a spray bottle every now and again, because they don't really recognise standing water to drink from, but they will recognise water droplets, so you can make sure they're hydrated in that way. But really, apart from that, they are just, as long as you spot clean them, clean up any poo as they make a mess, then basically there's not really much maintenance involved at all. As you might have gathered, there is quite a big cost difference for each of the different species. Leopard geckos are probably the cheapest. Now, I am talking from the perspective of keeping them in like full naturalistic setup, so like I have. So it's sort of when you buy everything is sort of as expensive as it can be. Then leopard geckos are going to be the cheapest because the wooden enclosures are cheaper than the glass enclosures that Cresties live in. So they are cheaper than crested geckos, but bearded dragons are by far the most expensive because they have more maintenance costs in terms of feeding them, more maintenance costs in terms of powering the electricity to the enclosures, much bigger startup costs with bigger enclosures and larger heat bulbs and stuff. So bearded dragons are easily the most expensive of the three. And then, just to recap, there isn't too much of a difference between leopard geckos and crested geckos, but leopard geckos probably just about have it. So which species out of leopard geckos, crested geckos and bearded dragons would I recommend the most to a beginner? Well, as you can probably guess, I would say leopard geckos win by a mile, because they're the cheapest, they don't take up very much space, there aren't really any major health concerns to get to grips with, they're really good for handling, and just they're overall really easy to get to grips with. I mean, I have been working with them for 5 years now, so I do have quite a lot of experience. But really, for crested geckos, the thing that lets them down is the handling aspect, especially for a beginner. Like I say, I don't really mind not being able to handle them, but that, for a beginner, it's like getting used to something flying about and having to catch it when it's jumping round, and then you're frightened of it shedding its tail. Especially when I first got mine, that was sort of a really big downside. And then for bearded dragons, it's honestly just the size of everything that they need makes them really quite expensive, and the beginner might not have as much space dedicated to a big vivarium like that, so it's not really practical. And then also brumation is a really big thing to get to grips with, because it is quite stressful doing it for the first time. I can say from first-hand experience, even though it's just natural, it is something that you've got to get your head round. Of course, there are pros and cons to each of the species, and which of the three is my favourite is actually a completely different question as to which is sort of the best for the beginner, and that'll probably be the same for you too. Say bearded dragons, you might like bearded dragons far more than the geckos, and so if that's what you're into, then you shouldn't get another species just because it's easier to keep. They are still a very good beginner species relative to what you can get. It's just that there's different things to take into consideration, and with all of these things being equal, I would say that leopard geckos are the easiest to take care of. So anyway guys, I do really hope that you enjoyed this video. I did put quite a lot of thought into it because I wanted to address things in my own way. I know there are other videos out on the internet about this and, you know, different things that you'll read, but I wanted to throw my own spin on it because I have got some experience with each of these species now, and hopefully it's helped you out. If you want to see more videos like this, then do hit subscribe and don't forget to leave a comment and a like, because that does really help out the channel. Now next week's video is going to be a really exciting one. The same really exciting one was supposed to come out a few weeks ago, but it didn't happen. But it is happening now, for definite, certainly, unless I blow up or something, but you know, let's sort of ignore those freak disasters and move on. So from me, that is it, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.